name is Afshin Marashi, and I'm the Farzaneh Family Professor of Iranian Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of everyone at the Farzaneh Center and the University of Oklahoma, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the OU Iranian Studies podcast. This is another in our ongoing series of podcast interviews with visiting speakers at the OU Farzaneh Center and other scholars in the field of Iranian history, culture, politics, and society. I should say that the podcast has been on sort of a hiatus for a few years, and we're trying to reboot the podcast. We started it before COVID, I guess that's BC. And now we were sort of on hold for a few years, but now we're trying to reboot the podcast. And so today we are honored to have with us Shaherzad Ahmadi, who is a professor of history at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Welcome, Shaherzad, to the OU Iranian Studies podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us. Shaherzad has just published a book titled Bordering on War, A Social and Political History of Khuzestan, published by the University of Texas Press. And I'm eager to chat with you about the book, Shaherzad. First of all, congratulations on the book. How does it feel to have it sort of out in the world finally?
It's a privilege for it to be out of the world and a relief for it to be out of my hands. So it's good.
Yeah, I can understand. I think it was originally published at the end of 2024.
That's right.
Okay. So we're now recording this in July of 2025. So it's about a 6 month. It's still new in the world, I would say. The book, I should also add, was part of a book series that Huri Berberian and I co-edit at the University of Texas Press, titled "Connected Histories of the Middle East and the Global South." And we're always eager to find new manuscripts. So if anyone within the sound of my voice has manuscripts that they're working on, we're eager to consider them. Your manuscript, Shaherzad, was actually something we recruited pretty early on, and I've been following the evolution of this project for at least a few years now. And I think it began as a PhD dissertation. Is that correct?
That's right.
And you were at UT Austin?
Correct.
And so when did it finish as a PhD?
2018.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's when I moved to Minnesota to,
Oh, okay.
to teach at St. Thomas.
Oh, okay. And so you were a student of Kamran Agai?
That's right.
Okay, yeah. Kamran and I, of course, are old friends, and we were at UCLA together, so we have a lot of history. I've always said to him, I think UT Austin has such a good modern Iranian studies program these days. It's kind of reminds me of UCLA in the 90s when there was a big batch of us all going through the PhD program, students of Nikki Keddie in that time. And now I think UT Austin has sort of developed something of a cohort of people that have passed through there in the last number of years. And I think we probably first met when I had gone down there for something at some point. Um, that's great. And so you're originally from California.
I am. I'm originally from Northern California.
Okay, and I'm from Southern California. Okay, very good. I always say Southern California is the Khuzestan of America. I don't know if you agree with that, but something like that. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, which is, we call it Valley Abad. So I don't know. And you grew up in Northern California.
I did, yes.
Okay, all right, very good. That's have to put that into the geography of Iranian culture somehow. I guess that would be Shomot. Anyway, the book really does deserve to be read and reviewed and cited by everyone. I'm sure it will be. I hope it gets a lot of attention, and I'm sure it will be an important source for the history of the Iran-Iraq border zone for many years to come. There's obviously a lot in the book that we can discuss. It's very detailed. It's extremely well researched. But without trying to be comprehensive, maybe we can just sort of touch on a few of the big themes that I think jumped out at me as I was reading through the book again to get ready for this. I mean, maybe we can just start at the beginning or in the most general sense. to just talk about the general topic of the book and the central argument. Where is Khuzestan? Why is Khuzestan important? Maybe you can start with that.
I think it's important for many reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it is an oil-rich province, and so it contributed enormously to the Iranian economy. Second, it's a very diverse region with various tribes and ethnic groups, as well as religious groups that created a confusing tapestry, let's say, for two nations that emerged in the early 20th century, Iran and Iraq. Both of those states were operating on earlier treaties that established a boundary, a border, and the residents of Khuzestan navigated what that meant for them. And so, for the history of Iran, it's economically important. For the history of borderlands, it's a dynamic space to understand the emergence of not only borders, but also citizenship. And for my purposes, I considered it a valuable entry point in understanding the way that migrants and border dwellers shaped not only the national discourse on borders, but also local understandings of loyalty. How do you articulate yourself to your state, and how do you maintain an independence that allows for your own self-interest, whether it's economic, you want to trade, whether it's educational, you want to study somewhere, whatever it might be, your own self-interest to thrive.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting to me that I connected with very well in thinking about the what you're doing here is that in this region, it is, I think one of the terms you use in the book is that it's sort of a liminal space. It's a region that is sort of in between, not only sort of politically in terms of the border, but sort of culturally, demographically speaking. And of course, in the Middle East as a whole, there are these sort of regions like this. So I think, in one sense, the Khuzestan or the Iran-Iraq borderland region, it reminded me of sort of Eastern Anatolia with Kurds and Turks and Armenians, and how all of these themes that you're describing in Khuzestan were negotiated in that region. Or Orit Bashkin has all these really interesting books that she's written about the history of the Arab Jews, and sort of navigating those kinds of things. I think this book or this topic really does kind of fit into that larger discussion. Maybe you can, I mean, so who, demographically speaking, who are we talking about here? Who are the Iraqi Iranians or the Iranian Iraqis, the Arab Iranians, the Persian Iraqis, the Arabized Iranians? These are it sort of sounds like the mountain Turks, which is what the Turks used to call the Kurds. Yeah, how would the terminology is a little bit almost jarring or confusing, because of course we're used to thinking in terms of the nation states and sort of the uniformity of identity. But how would you sort of describe the demography on the ground in this particular region?
I struggled with the terminology. I try to remain consistent in subsets, but
Uh-huh.
there was an intentional fluidity that I tried to introduce, which is to say, I didn't know how to refer to certain people, and that seemed in and of itself to have some analytic value. So the demographics of, and I should also be more specific. So I'm not so much interested in the entire province of Khuzestan, which is enormous and
Right.
very diverse. I'm especially interested in the two cities that are very close to each other, Abadan and Khorramshahr.
Hmm.
And part of the reason why they animate the book is that they're the two cities that many believed were majority Arab.
Hmm.
I'm not certain of this. In fact, the census records that we have, which Iran began producing in the mid 1950s suggests an enormous amount of immigration into these two cities. And so the idea that they remained majority Arab seems suspect to me, but that was certainly the way that both Iraqi observers and Iranians who visited the area described the cities as sort of historically Arab, having an Arab heritage, and even being demographically majority Arab. And so those are the two areas that I'm most interested in. Part of my argument is that there was so much migration between these border cities in Khuzestan and neighboring Basra in Iraq that it's very difficult to ascertain how we as scholars and also states as official actors assessed them, categorized them. And perhaps it's not so important how we categorize them. It's more important the way that they articulated their needs.
Hmm.
And so, whether somebody is an Arabized
Right.
Iranian living in Basra, it doesn't so much matter. What matters is how did they benefit from their positionality
Right.
as somebody with, let's say, an Iranian passport living in Basra, seeking employment. How did they utilize the system to their advantage? That's
Yeah.
the more important kind of way of thinking
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, that's a big theme I think that really comes out in the book is that the focus really is at the local level and how these agents, these actors, these people on the ground, how they navigated and sort of made sort of asserted their own identity or their own position in this particular region. But that's a really difficult thing to kind of tease out in the sources. And you have a lot of really interesting things to say in the book about how the method of your research in this and how you went about conducting the research for this. And you mentioned the census records from the 50s. I guess the first one was really in 56, and then it was every 10 years, the Iranian census. And that seems like it's an important source for you, and use other kinds of sources. Maybe you can talk about the sources and how do you go about teasing out the history, the social history at the local level through these kinds of maybe state produced source material. That's kind of an interesting topic that might be useful for other people doing similar kinds of research.
I try to reckon with this in the introduction that there is an internal contradiction in my kind of methodology or approach that I'm saying I'm really interested in the social history. I want to understand local understandings of loyalty and communal relationships. And I am also using state documents. And so, how do I square that circle with myself? The first is I am really interested in the complementary source materials of both Iraqi and Iranian archives. And so I put those two in conversation with each other in order to better understand the way that the same communities could be described differently. And so maybe somewhere in that gap, we can, as historians, piece together, I don't want to say a counter narrative, but kind of a new way of thinking
Hmm.
about the local within the context of an emergent nation.
Yeah.
And then the second type, so state archives, that's part of what I use. The second type of source material that I was very interested in was memoirs.
Hmm.
And those memoirs were both revealing in that they described a kind of zeitgeist of a time, but also the way that, in particular, Iranian memoirs have been published really lean into archival sources. And so you find a lot of scanned documents within memoirs.
Hmm.
Now, as an American researcher in Iran, it was very difficult for me to access particularly wartime materials. And so I leaned into those sources. Nevertheless, I supplemented them with state archives from the Iraqi side, which I could very easily archive at Hoover at Stanford.
Hmm.
And so the memoirs were not only complemented by newspaper sources, which I used, but also Iraqi state records. And then the third type of material that I really leaned into were census records,
Hmm.
which were just invaluable for establishing employment rates, ages, educational attainment, immigration numbers. One thing that I thought was really important to establish from the outset was what we didn't know about an area that was both very sensitive. It was an area that Iran had a huge incentive to gather information about because it was an oil producing area, but also an area that was like the ambiguity benefited certain actors. And so Iraqi scholars who spent time in Khorramshahr and Abadan could lean into the fact that the census records did not necessarily establish ethnic demographics. And so there was this possibility. Could it be that if Abadan, say, is 65% Arab, then could it be that those Arabs would be open to Arab governors or Arab governing? And so all of those materials began to put together a portrait that I intended to feel unstable.
Hmm.
I intended to present it in a way that as soon as you read something that an Iraqi scholar said, I would then say, well,
Yeah,
then this Iranian scholar says the opposite thing. And let's look
exactly.
at, yeah.
I
So
like the dialogue you have between, I think it's, is it the Iraqi historian Najjar and Ahmad Kasravi, the great historian of Khuzestan. And so you kind of play those two historians of the same place off against each other. And that's exactly the kind of teasing out of the source material that I think is a really important way of approaching it to kind of highlight the ambiguity and sort of how these things are constantly in a state of being made and remade. And that's part of the story that you're telling. It kind of reminded me a little bit also of, especially looking at state records, even you use Savak records. And I don't know if you use any Iraqi state police records, but looking at those kinds of things, it reminded me of sort of what the subaltern studies people do in looking at the colonial archive. And, there's the famous phrase, I don't know if it's Ranajit Guha or whoever it was who said, you read against the grain,
right, famously. Yeah.
famously, yeah. And you kind of read the archival sources not for what's on the surface, but almost what's sort of below the surface. And I think in some ways the national archives can be approached the same way. And I think that's maybe part of what you're doing here.
It is. One thing that stood out to me when I accessed the Iranian National Archive in the Library of Congress was how forthcoming many of the surveillance officials were about what was not in the records. So, in other words, they would write to their supervisor, I'm sending you this, but for every person I'm catching,
Mm-hmm.
there are so many people that were missing. And
Right.
and on the Iraqi side, you would read a lot of excitement about, I mean, depending on the perspective, but for, let's say, an Iraqi scholar who's from Basra, who's Shi'i, who is an Arab partisan, who's spending some time in Abadan and Khorramshahr, it's not at all a negative that there's so much migration, and that's
Right.
extolled as a kind of virtue
It's the
of
natural
life, and it's the
flow.
natural,
Yeah.
exactly. Why wouldn't they move around? Because they feel comfortable in Iraq, and
Hmm.
that is indicative of something. And so,
Yeah.
those.
Mhm.
Anyway, I agree. I was really about reading against the grain and trying my best to find not just concrete examples, but kind of personal examples, kind of like whether it's a family or whether it's a community or even like a school that might be housing refugees, just to offer a kind of physical landscape of what this looked like for people on the ground.
Yeah, I mean that obviously the pilgrimage, economy is a big part of the story that moved people back and forth, despite the fact that there is this line on the ground, as it were, and we can maybe say more about that. Maybe we can talk about the border itself. Um, what is the sort of when I teach Middle Eastern history, one of the things I always teach, maybe you have some version of this as well, is that all the lines on the map that you see on the political map of the Middle East, those are all artificial lines drawn by British and French diplomats after World War One with pencils and rulers. And all of those are artificial lines, but I always say, well, one exception of that is the Iran-Iraq border, which does have a kind of pre-20th century history of sorts. I'm never entirely sure if I'm overselling that, but in comparison to something like Sykes-Picot or the mandates, it's probably true. But what is the actual history of that line, such as it is? Maybe we can just do a little primer on the line on the map between Iran and Iraq. How far back does it actually go?
That's a great question. So there was clearly a delineation at that border in the Safavid period, which is a long
Right.
time ago. And so
Exactly.
there's no question that that area of Mesopotamia was understood really as Ottoman territory.
Hmm.
And to add further, very often the way that people tend to think about that that became eventually Iraq is, well, it had so many Shi'is and therefore it had some connection to Iran, but that was a very late occurrence. That Iraq becoming Shi'i
Of
was a
course.
product of of Tanzimat policies, of the reform policies. So that area was really understood as Ottoman.
Okay.
And that the border, I mean, one of the things that I find personally sort of amusing about this whole story of the border is that we're really talking in terms of the debate about where the border should be about a very small area. I mean, it's within the waterway. It's not as though anyone on either side thinks all of Basra should be part of Iran or that all of Khuzestan should be part of Iraq. That's not the conversation. So indeed, these areas were firmly understood within the imaginations of both the Ottomans and the Qajars, Safavids even, and then later the Pahlavis and the Hashemites,
Hmm.
as firmly in one territorial boundary and the other. Now, where the people fell on those boundaries, that was a more ambiguous question. And tribes were moving constantly for a variety of reasons. But it's always, I try to make the point in the book, and it's always interesting to me that where the claim was made by Arab partisans in Iraq, which I call Pan-Arabists in the book, and we can talk maybe more about Pan-Arabism later.
Hmm.
But the claim being made was always very specific. And it was really being made on demographic grounds. It wasn't being made on historic grounds.
Hmm.
Like, oh, of course Abadan should be part of Iraq because X. I agree with you. The way that that border was imagined had been imagined that way for hundreds of years. It was not a recent thing.
I see. Well, and I guess it's at some point in the 30s, you have some discussions between, I guess it would be the Hashemites and Reza Shah to actually demarcate it more formally. Is that the Treaty of Erzurum? I think you mentioned that. Is that
The
what that
Treaty of
is?
Erzurum is in the mid 19th
19th
century,
century.
and then later in once the Hashemite monarchy emerges and the Pahlavi monarchy emerges, there is a debate about whether or not the exact border within the waterway
Hmm.
delineating Iran and Iraq, if
Right.
that should remain the way that it is.
I
And the
see.
Pahlavi monarchy would like
I
to
see.
extend it further out.
Okay.
Why? Because there was commercial value
Right.
from the trade in the waterway. But
That's right.
Reza Shah was not necessarily interested in absorbing
Hmm.
parts of Basra. It was much more, I would like more of the commercial enterprise to be taxed on our
Hmm.
side of the boundary.
I see.
And actually, early in the Hashemite monarchy, Faisal travels to Iran,
Yeah.
is very interested in the life of, in fact, he goes through this very region, this borderline of
Oh,
Khuzestan.
okay. I didn't know that. Yeah, that would be a great story to tell or an article to write about Faisal's trip to the state visit to Iran, and I guess it was 32 or 4, something like that. It comes up in a lot of the sources. I did some research on Tagore's visit to Iran. I think Faisal and Tagore were in Iran at the same time or something like that. It
I think
overlapped
so.
quite a
Yeah.
bit. That's an interesting part of the story. Actually, the other thing that came up was, when I was working on the Parsi book, the Parsis in India really started to have an interest, a kind of commercial and real estate interest in Khuzestan. And there was all of this discussion about Parsis, migrating back to Iran in the 20s and 30s. But they weren't really focused as much on going to Yazd and Kerman, which was sort of the historic, pockets of Zoroastrians inside Iran. Where they were really interested in going back to was Khuzestan because of the commercial interests and possibilities that they saw for the port region in Khuzestan as a place of sort of like what Bombay had been maybe a century earlier, that then blossomed to become a great global port city. So there was a lot of, like you're saying, there was a lot of economic interests as well that defined these kinds of the interest in defining this particular region. But beyond the diplomatic and the political history, the social history, which is sort of really what you focus on a great deal in the book, the sort of fluidity between both sides of the border. Maybe we can say something about that. I mean, you talk a lot about smugglers and how did they actually get back and forth? How was the border policed, and how did people get around that?
I have an article about the late 19th century, and what I was very interested in for that piece was the fact that the erection of border
Mm-hmm.
surveillance edifices, but also the placement of border surveillance guards were done with the cooperation of locals. They understood what was happening. In fact, they would hold big banquets to welcome the British who were participating, the Swedes who were participating in that endeavor. But nobody cared about the actual rules. I mean, there was so much emphasis placed on, okay, we have to build it exactly here so that it's clear to everybody where this border is. And yet, as they were building it, everyone commented incessantly that nobody seemed to be taking into account this border.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things that I think is extremely typical of water borders,
Mm-hmm.
that they really do unite people. I mean, it's much easier to patrol land borders than it is. I mean, there's obviously challenges there too, but water borders are very difficult. And there was so much value in traveling commercially that it continued. I wouldn't say unabated because, of course, people were arrested. That's why we have records. We have records because people were arrested. But in general, and there is an understanding of this within the broader historiography that it's not until the 1920s, 1930s that you see a more aggressive crackdown. So you see Reza Shah trying to have a better handle of that area. And part of that was because of the local Arab leadership that seemed to challenge his authority. And so there was some political dynamic there that was very important for Reza Shah to assert himself. Once that happens, and once the Anglo-Iranian oil company becomes increasingly dominant in the local economy, and so the economy is really rapidly shifting from a kind of local commercial enterprise as a port city that is welcoming an influx of international goods from the Gulf, from Iraq, from everywhere. And it's now becoming really an oil city with a huge number of international people. I mean, one of the things that I don't really cover in the book, but I write about elsewhere, is just how diverse the professional class was in Abadan and Khorramshahr for city. I mean, they really punched above their weight considering the
Right.
kind of population that they had started with.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, by the 1930s, you have British physicians, you have Indian engineers, you have all kinds of people operating
It
here.
started to look like Bombay.
It started to look like Bombay. Exactly. I mean, I wrote an article years ago about, and I collected this information from the Iranian National Archive, and I couldn't figure out a way to put it in the book because it just really didn't fit. But one of my anecdotes about this was an Arab family had their daughter got sick, and so they went to a Persian pharmacist, and the Persian pharmacist gives them a prescription. The daughter gets sicker. So then they go to an Indian pharmacist, and the Indian pharmacist says, "Oh, that Persian pharmacist didn't know what he was talking about. He gave you totally the wrong prescription. Here's the right prescription." So the daughter gets better. Then they go to the police to report this, and the police then goes to a Russian physician who's working there, and the Russian physician says you should withdraw the license of this Persian pharmacist who's totally incompetent. And so then it creates this long ordeal for the pharmacist who's saying, "You know what? I have my license through Iran, and I don't know who these other operators are." And just how many options this poor Arab family had.
Yeah,
They could access
that's
so
true.
many different kinds of people in an area that really 20 years ago did not have that kind of intellectual capital.
That's true.
So it's just a really interesting space, and it changed so dramatically. And part of what Reza Shah was trying to do was make sure that the people who were benefiting from that economic transformation were locals.
Hmm.
This was the way that he presented his whole immigration focus, that I want to make sure that the people who are working there are really Iranian.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that was a I mean, that's a major part of the mid 20th century
Yeah.
story. The
Well, I think you're actually right in describing Reza Shah's policy towards Khuzestan as part of really his larger history of the economic history of that time and economic nationalism. I think it's actually kind of an underdeveloped subfield in 20th century Iranian historiography, and maybe especially of the Reza Shah period, is the economic history of that period, and to integrate Khuzestan economically into a national economy. I think one of the things your book does very well is to contribute to that topic. So I think readers will maybe look at the book for that reason as well. But maybe we can talk about the other big nationalism that defines the history of this region, and that of course is Arab nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism. And maybe we can talk about that. When we usually tell the story of pan-Arabism, we talk about the Suez Crisis of '56. Maybe we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict and territorial disputes between Zionism and Arab nationalism. But I think what's really interesting about this book is that the connection that it makes, and I think you make this connection, maybe this is part of the question, is how Khuzestan becomes part of the story, the struggle, a larger history of Arab nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism in the middle decades of the 20th century. And that's a big bulk of the book. I mean, this is a book as much about the history of Iraq as it is about the history of Iran. And I think that discussion I found really interesting. So maybe we can sort of think about how does Khuzestan, or Arabistan, I guess, is sort of the Arab nationalist way of thinking about it. How does this particular episode or this part of that story fit into the history of Arab nationalism?
Part of what I was trying to accomplish in the organization of the book was to reconceptualize our approach to studying a borderland province. And I think an even better take on it would have been to periodize by various governorships of Khuzestan.
Interesting.
In lieu of that, I really wanted to prioritize Pan-Arabism as a way of thinking about the region, which is what led me to periodize by Iraqi political
Yes.
history.
Right.
So um, I was very interested in particular in the way that different Iraqi presidents in the post-Hashemite period, so after the monarchy collapses, um, Abdul Karim Qassem takes over and creates the Iraqi Republic, and I was very interested in the way that subsequent presidents conceived of Khuzestan? Was it a borderland with resources that they could try to exploit at times of Iranian vulnerability? Or were there people who were genuinely invested in creating a narrative of the Iraqi nation that included these Arab border dwellers who happened to sit on oil-rich territory? In other words, the people who advocated for absorbing these Arab border dwellers in Iran did not put oil as their top priority. They really centered the population.
Hmm.
And so I became very interested in the way that that Pan-Arabism was used by Iraqis in particular, but also Iraqi Shi'is.
Hmm.
They were interested in Palestine. I mean, they were very invested in the question of Zionism and things that resonated with the broader Arab world, and they were self-aware of Iraq's unique role in the Arab world as a Shi'i majority Arab country. Nevertheless, the Shi'ism became a kind of entry point for them to describe themselves as loyal Pan-Arabists, while also offering an introduction to the broader Arab world, the Sunni world, about their downtrodden brethren in Iran. That you might not think of them as part of this discourse because you think of them as part of the Iranian umbrella and that they've been somehow
Hmm.
co-opted by Iran to be less Arab, that they've become kind of Persianized, but actually they're committed Arab nationalists. They're in tune with our conversations. We're invested in their plight. And their framing was very interesting to me, which is that Tehran, that the Iranian kind of Persian ethnocentric nationalism mirrored Zionism, and that the Arab Shi'is in this borderland area had been subjugated much in the same way that Palestinians had been subjugated. So um, it seemed like a meaningful way of understanding Pan-Arabism through an Iraqi Shi'i lens.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's really interesting, and that really jumped out at me because it seemed like a another chapter in the story of Pan-Arabism in a way that we don't really tell that story, and I think that's one of the things I think this book helps to do is to kind of think about the Iran-Iraq war. We think of it as sort of a military conflict between Iran and Iraq, but it's really part of a larger narrative of the history of Pan-Arabism as well. And so I think that's something that we can think about in terms of Middle Eastern history and Arab history that your book makes an interesting contribution towards as well. Maybe we can just sort of talk about, just to finish off here, about really the kind of contemporary perspective of all of this. You know, the war in the 80s is kind of, is over. Saddam Hussein is gone. The Ba'ath regime is gone. Even the Islamic Republic, has evolved in ways it's greatly diminished. You might say it's a failed project, continuously, chronically teetering on the verge of something else. But yet the border, how has all of this affected the border? One of the interesting themes that you kind of end the book with is this idea of the limits of state power. And it seemed to me that, these state regimes, these statist projects, nation building projects seem to come and go, but the border seems to have its own logic, its own rhythm. How do you kind of see that?
One of the things that I was fascinated by was how little literature there was on the topic of Iraqis in Iran, particularly considering how dramatic the demographics change after the United States' invasion into Iraq in 2003. I expected there to be a lot more, if not from a kind of American perspective of, this is this is a way of understanding the long-term consequences of Iran's geopolitical investment in Iraq, that they supported
Right.
Iraqi migrants to return to Iraq and become kind of dominant in the political scene in the aftermath of Saddam Hussein's ousting, the Ba'ath Party's ousting. Um, I thought that there would be more on the Iranian side. I was really surprised, and I what's part of what I think this alludes to, or what it kind of speaks to, is two things. One is that after the Iran-Iraq War, and this is something that really there should be a lot more research about, um, there were massive evacuations of this area, which completely transformed the demographics. And so a lot of people who were native border dwellers end up in places like Esfahan and Shiraz, and they don't return.
Hmm.
The reinvestment in the area was really poor. It's very limited in resources. And so the people who do return usually either can fund their return or they're so poor that, and you see this a lot in the archives, the refugee resettlement archives in Iran. It was very challenging for people to return home. So that's one. And the second is that a lot of the people that did end up in this borderland area were people who had escaped Iraq during the 1991 Intifada. And so that adds this other layer of kind of confusion about demographics, who lives here, what's going on here. And it served the purposes of the Islamic Republic after the Iran-Iraq War to kind of allow that fluidity, to say that they were supporting the Iraqi Shias in this time of persecution in Iraq. And so the exact same fluidity that the Islamic Republic was hysterical about in 79 when they first arrive becomes something that they're kind of incentivizing by 91, 92. And so they're trapped in this too. Like, how do we deal with the borderland, and how do we deal with limiting movement at the border? Part of the problem for both states is that this is such an important commercial district. I mean,
Right.
people don't, unless like Iranians mention this whenever I give a talk about this area, Iranians will always talk about how commercially rich this area is. Like, if you want any good, that's where you go. It's
Hmm.
the bazaars are great. And when I was staying there, I was really struck by how much more commercial it was than I expected, despite all that I had heard. And also, how much more diverse the access to goods were as compared to Tehran, which you always imagine is like the most. So I think there is, from my perspective, there is still this fluidity. It's still very apparent that you can go back and forth. People talk about it. And it's still politically motivated. In other words, people are still moving during times of political turmoil.
Well, I think that's, yeah, one of the underlying continuities that I think your book helps to illustrate. And I think looking at the local history really does kind of help to change the perspective and highlight some of these these continuities that cut across a lot of the political periodizations that might seem to be separating the past. Well, I think we have a lot more that we could discuss regarding the book, but I think we should probably end it there. But I'll certainly encourage listeners to get the book. It's published by the University of Texas Press, 2024. And hopefully we can have conversations like this moving forward with Shaherzad and with others. But thank you, Shaherzad, for joining us on the OU Iranian Studies podcast. Thanks to our listeners. And until next time, we hope to see you and hear from you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.